We're continuing with our discussion of Chapter 1 of Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, beginning at the point where he starts to discuss the question of the meaning of the term Introduction to Metaphysics, which for him involves questioning beyond beings as such. Heidegger initially had said that questioning about beings as such and as a whole received its first inception with the Greeks, who called beings physis. Of course, we assume that this inception was the inception of metaphysics. But what is metaphysics? Conventionally, historians will say that the term metaphysics arose as a catch-all term for the collection of books that Aristotle's posthumous editor placed after Aristotle's physics. Heidegger, however, tells a different story about the meaning of the term. This is on page 19, towards the bottom. He says, in Greek, away over something, over beyond, is meta. Philosophical questioning about beings as such is metaphysica. It questions on beyond beings. It is metaphysics. At this point, we do not need to trace the history of the genesis and meaning of this term in detail. What's the relation of the why being question? The question, why are there beings at all rather than nothing? What's the relation of this question to metaphysics, so understood? By putting all beings into question, Heidegger notes, the questioner places himself beyond beings, which is, according to his account, the distinctive move of metaphysics, placing oneself beyond beings. But now we need to discuss the difference between the question of the being of beings and the question of being as such. Metaphysics is not a simple matter for Heidegger because metaphysics in the West has traditionally glossed over and collapsed these crucial distinctions. We've noted that Heidegger first spoke of the first inception of metaphysics as involving questioning about beings as such and as a whole. However, such questioning is ambiguous for Heidegger. First of all, we need to distinguish between beings and being, between beings and being, and then also between this beings as such and as a whole that he refers to in connection with the inception of metaphysics, from the being of beings, and also from being as such. So we have this sort of count. First, there's the distinction between beings and being. And we'll conventionally use the capital B for being just to help to emphasize the distinction. But we shouldn't want to read any theological importance into that or anything like that. But we have this distinction, the distinction between beings and being, which is traditionally known in Heidegger discussions as the ontological difference. The ontological difference being the difference between beings and being. But also, there is underneath this a further distinction, which is the distinction between beings as such and as a whole, and the distinction between the being of beings and being as such. So under being here, we need to distinguish between two senses or an ambiguity in this term where it can mean the being of beings or being as such. The distinction between beings and being, as I noted, is known as the ontological difference, and it's key to Heidegger's thought. And later in this chapter, he explains this using the example of a piece of chalk. So we'll briefly jump ahead a bit here to page 34. The bottom third of the page, he's discussing a piece of chalk, and he says, on the one hand, being means what at any time is in being. In particular, this grayish-white, light, breakable mass formed in such and such a way. On the other hand, being means that which, as it were, makes this a being instead of non-being. That which being is what makes this a being instead of non-being. That which makes up the being in being, if it is a being. So that's being with the capital B here. That's which makes these individual beings into a being as opposed to a non-being, he says. That's what the being of beings is. That which makes a being rather than a non-being. That which makes up the being of a being if it is in being. In accordance with this twofold meaning of the word being, the Greek toon often designates the second meaning, that is, not the being itself, what is in being, but rather the in-being, beingness, to be in being, with the capital B. So the naming of beings with the term physis was, according to Heidegger, a determination of the being of beings. That is, it represented an understanding of being, of what it is to be, of what makes a being a being. To the question, what is the being of being? What is the being that makes beings into beings as opposed to non-beings? To that question, the Greeks at the inception of metaphysics answered physis. Heidegger observes that metaphysics has always stayed with this answer. On the top of page 20, he says, physics determines the essence and the history of metaphysics from the inception onward. However, the question, what is being as such? What is being as such is a different question than this question of the being of beings. Heidegger says mysteriously that this question has a different essence and a different provenance. This question, however, is regarded by metaphysical thinking as the same as the question of beings as such and as a whole. However, he regards this as a misconstrual of the question. So if we fill in this diagram, we have something like this, that beings designates physical beings. Being as such in the whole is something like the total aggregate of physical beings and their relations. So that's our first part. Beings is physical beings. Being as such and as a whole is, roughly speaking, the physical world, the totality of physical reality. And then the being of beings would be something like we might describe as physicality. It's physicality, physicalness, physical character or physical nature, that which makes beings physical beings. But this still leaves this question as a question mark, the question of being as such. Evidently, to consider beings as such is to consider them as beings. To consider them as beings for Western metaphysics is to consider them as physical beings. To consider physical beings as a whole is to consider the collection or aggregate of all physical beings and their relations. And physicality seems to be an apt way to describe the being of these beings. We might say that what it means for them to be is to be physical, according to metaphysics, Western metaphysics. And beyond this, one might well answer what more there is to be said about being. So what does Heidegger mean by being as such? Let's see what Heidegger says about this. The bottom of page 20, last half dozen lines. The question about being as such is misconstrued as coinciding with the question about beings as such. This misconstrual thrusts itself upon us above all because the essential provenance of the question about beings as such, plural, beings as such, and with it the essence of metaphysics, lies in obscurity. So the question of being stands from the perspective of Heidegger in an ambiguous and confused state. In the traditional metaphysical sense, which I will heretofore or hereafter, there I got it right finally, hereafter I will refer to this tradition just as metaphysics. In the traditional metaphysics sense, the question of being is a question about beings as such. In the Heideggerian perspective, it means asking about being as such. So there's an ambiguity there. Is the question about being to be understood metaphysically as a question about beings as such and as a whole, or is it a question about being as such? It's characteristic of metaphysics, according to Heidegger, not to see the difference between these two questions. In metaphysics, he says, being as such is forgotten. In metaphysics, this is forgotten, or it is simply assimilated to the question of the being of beings, or beings as such and as a whole. This question is obscured. It remains concealed. It is in oblivion. So if being as such is not the same as beings as such and as a whole, and is not the being of beings, for example, physicality, then what is it? Heidegger suggests that his introduction to metaphysics is an instruction in how to ask the question that has been obscured by metaphysics, which concerns the hidden essence of metaphysics itself. On page 22, he writes, questions are not given like shoes, clothes, or books. Questions are as they are actually asked, and this is the only way in which they are. Thus, the leading into the asking of the fundamental question, the leading into the asking, it's worth noting here that the German word that we translate introduction has the sense or connotation of leading into. The literal meaning of the word for introduction in German is a sense of leading into. So that's what he's alluding to here. Thus, the leading into the asking of the fundamental question is not a passage over to something that lies or stands around somewhere. Instead, this leading to must first awaken and create the questioning. Leading is the questioning going ahead, or questioning ahead. So Heidegger says, well, we will be leading you into this question that we don't have a clear sense of anymore. The question of being as such, which is in oblivion for us. Heidegger is going to, as it were, take us by the hand and lead us into this question. That's the aim of the introduction, or the leading into metaphysics. This leads us to the first discussion question. Do Heidegger's distinctions between beings, the being of beings, and being as such make sense to you? So here they are again. Do these distinctions between beings and being, and between the being of beings and being as such, make sense? How, if at all, does the question, why are there beings at all rather than nothing, force us to consider these distinctions? So that's the first discussion question. Do Heidegger's distinctions between beings, the being of beings, and being as such make sense to you? how, if at all, does the question, why are there beings at all rather than nothing, force us to consider these distinctions? Next, Heidegger turns to unfolding this why being question by means of the question of the nothing. The nothing. Why are there beings at all rather than nothing? That's the question. On a casual reading of this question, you might take it, and I believe in the last video I sometimes glossed it, as synonymous with why is there anything at all? That's what it sounds like when we first look at this question. Why are there beings at all rather than nothing? So the question itself, of course, has these two parts. You can draw a line here to emphasize this. First part, why are there beings? The second part, rather than nothing. And Heidegger is going to ask about the status, particularly of this second part. I said that sometimes, last time I casually glossed this as the same as the question, as if it were the same as the question, why is there anything at all? But now, to be more precise, we have to note that this is not the same as the question, why is there anything at all? Because there are these two parts to the question, why are there beings rather than nothing? Last time I also said we shouldn't be surprised if Heidegger adopted this question strategically. And here we begin to see that this is in fact the case. The strategy that he's adopting depends upon the very specific way in which he poses this question. It has two parts separated by a break. Why is there being at all, and why is there not rather nothing? The first part contains what is interrogated, namely beings. This can create the impression that the whole question is really contained in the first part, which would make it possible to substitute why is there anything at all for the question. So it seems like this part is a superfluous part of the question rather than nothing, a kind of appendix that we could easily lop off without missing anything. On this reading, the second part is an embellishing flourish, inconsequential in itself. Heidegger expresses this on the bottom, well, actually the whole page pretty much on besides the footnote. On page 26, for what more are we supposed to ask about nothing? Nothing is simply nothing. Questioning has nothing more to seek here. Above all, by bringing up nothing, we do not gain the slightest thing for the knowledge of beings. Whoever talks about nothing does not know what he is doing. In speaking about nothing, he makes it into something. By speaking this way, he speaks against what he means. He contradicts himself. But self-contradictory speech is an offense against the fundamental rule of speech, against logic. Talking about nothing is illogical. Whoever talks and thinks illogically is an unscientific person. Now, whoever goes so far as to talk about nothing within philosophy, which after all is the home of logic, deserves all the more to be accused of offending against the fundamental rule of all thinking. Such talk about nothing consists in utterly senseless propositions. Moreover, whoever takes nothing seriously takes the side of nullity. He obviously promotes the spirit of negation and serves disintegration. Talking about nothing not only is completely contrary to thought, it undermines all culture and all faith. Whatever both disregards the fundamental law of thinking and also destroys faith and the will to construct is pure nihilism. Now, this passage gives the impression that Heidegger is dismissing the nothing. But actually, it turns out nothing could be further from the truth. He's using one of his favorite rhetorical strategies, one that can be confusing to the reader who's new to Heidegger's writing style. This strategy is to give voice to the unthinking conventional attitude toward something. In this case, how conventional wisdom thinks about what's contained in the word nothing. namely that there's really nothing to think about here. And if you try to make it into something to think about, you're being illogical, unscientific, and so forth. To make nothing an object of thought is not only absurd, it's maybe morally and socially harmful. Your promoter, as he says, of disintegration and of nihilism. But for Heidegger, there's a connection between the question of nothing and the question of being. This conventional wisdom, for him, overlooks an important truth. Quoting on page 27, quote, "Since the inception of the question of what is, the question of what is not and of nothing has gone side by side with it." In what way? The nothing is the other or the outside or the beyond in relation to beings as a whole and as such. It is also the outside or the beyond to the particular understanding of being, to the being of beings. To speak of the nothing is to speak of what is excluded, what is suppressed by logic and science. Heidegger readily admits that talking about nothing is illogical. He doesn't want to deny it merely because it is conventional wisdom. However, he raises once again the question that has been suppressed throughout the entire history of metaphysics, namely, what gives logic the right to provide the measure and the law for our thought about being? What gives logic the right to provide the measure and the law for our thought about being? On page 28, Heidegger posits a number of things that logic represents only one possible, very particular answer to the question about beings. That the principle of non-contradiction provides, quote, only an illusion of rigor and scientificity. That one has no right to simply assume that logic is the ultimate court of appeal in philosophy. This may remind us of Aristotle's defense of the principle of non-contradiction, which Heidegger doesn't immediately challenge here. Along with this, Heidegger readily admits that the nothing is not a thing, that it is not something that we can talk about logically. But if it is not a thing and cannot be talked about logically, then neither can it be studied scientifically. And whoever wants to talk about the nothing must become unscientific. Fortunately, logical and scientific thinking is not the only type of rigorous, non-arbitrary thinking. Quite to the contrary, for Heidegger, scientific thinking is just a derivative and rigidified form of philosophical thinking. In other words, genuine philosophy is prior to logic and science. Poetry also stands with philosophy at a higher spiritual rank than science. Poetry and philosophy allow us to address beings, he says, quote, as if for the first time, unquote, on page 29. Poetry and philosophy allow us to address beings as if for the first time. For example, consider a poetic passage from Knut Hamsun on page 30. The poet says, quote, "He sits here between his ears and hears true emptiness. Quite amusing, a fancy. On the ocean, something stirred, and there was a sound, something audible, a watercourse. Here, nothing meets nothing and is not there. There's not even a hole. One can only shake one's head in resignation." Well, the Hamsun quote suggests that there is a way to talk meaningfully about the nothing, to disclose it to our Dasein. Heidegger admits that the nothing remains something peculiar. So he returns to the examination of whether the instead of nothing at the end of the why being question, whether this is doing any real philosophical work, or is it just a mere appendix? Heidegger proposes an experiment. What happens if we lop off the second half of the question? Okay, so we just asked this first part as if it were a standalone question. Why are there beings at all? Forgetting about this rather than nothing. What's the result? What, if any, change does that make? If we ask about beings in this way, we are immediately asking, Heidegger says, about their ground. This mode of interrogation, furthermore, is simply an extension of everyday questioning. Freiburg is wine country in Germany, so Heidegger uses a local example of some wilted vines. When one asks why are these vines wilted, one is asking for the ground of the wilt. Is it a bug? Is it an infection, a fungus? What is it? This searching for a ground biases us in favor of seeking a ground in a being that is at the same level of the beings we're asking about it. We might call this an objective ground. There obviously must be some objective ground for why these vines are wilted, for example, a bug. So to ask why are there beings at all, full stop, leads inevitably to a tendency to seek an answer in an objective ground of being, an objective ground that is a being, albeit a highest being. If we ask the question, though, in the initial sense, right, so we bring back in this second part, why are there beings at all rather than nothing? It's no longer the case that we're seeking an objective ground, another being, a higher being or highest being. Why is this? Because, quoting him here, quote, it prevents us in our questioning from beginning directly with beings as unquestionably given. That's on page 31. Prevents us in our questioning from beginning directly with beings as unquestionably given. The question, in other words, forces us to confront the possibility of there being nothing, which is a way of confronting the nothing, provided, of course, we are resolutely questioning, as Heidegger would put it, and taking it with all due seriousness. Heidegger says that once we've confronted the nothing in this way, beings begin to oscillate and waver. Beings begin to oscillate and waver, right? They begin to oscillate and waver. Non-being becomes a real possibility. Their stability, as it were, is lost. They begin to oscillate and waver. Accordingly, the why is no longer a search simply for an objective ground of being. Look at what Heidegger says here on page 32. Towards the top. The search for the why now transforms itself accordingly. It does not just try to provide a present at hand ground for explaining what is present at hand. Instead, we are now searching for a ground that is supposed to ground the dominance of beings as an overcoming of nothing. The term present at hand here translates Heidegger's term for what in analytic philosophy would simply be called an object, the paradigm of which is the object to be studied by scientific investigation. So if there is a ground, he's saying that it's no longer an objective ground, it's no longer an object, but rather the ground is now something that overcomes the nothing or the possibility of non-being. In sum, Heidegger believes that he's shown us that it really does make a big difference whether we include the second half of this question or not. If we don't include it, we're left searching just for an objective ground, something present at hand, another being among beings, even if it's the highest being. But if we do include this, then the character of the ground that we're seeking can no longer be regarded as something objective. Rather, it becomes an overcoming of non-being, something different from an object. This leads us to the second discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger that philosophy and poetry are more fundamental modes of the questioning of being than science and logic? Is he right that inquiry into the nothing is absurd from the perspective of science and logic? Does inquiry into the nothing make sense, even if pursued through philosophical and poetic means? Is the nothing a bona fide phenomenon? If so, what can this tell us about being as such? So once again, the second discussion question, do you agree with Heidegger that philosophy and poetry are more fundamental modes of the questioning of being than science and logic? Is he right that inquiry into the nothing is absurd from the perspective of science and logic? Does inquiry into the nothing make sense, even if pursued through philosophical and poetic means? Is the nothing a bona fide phenomenon? If so, what can this tell us about being as such? In this next part of the chapter, Heidegger is going to go beyond this initial question, the why question, why are there beings at all rather than nothing, to ask about what this question presupposes and whether there is some question that is even more prior. And this is going to allow him to arrive at a different question, namely the question, how does it stand with being? How does it stand with being? Recall the piece of chalk that Heidegger used to illustrate the distinction between being and beings. Immediately following the passage I quoted earlier, Heidegger asks how the possibility of non-being applies to entities and to the being or the essence of entities. So this is on page 35. He says, we have cataloged what the being is in the piece of chalk. We were able to find this out relatively easily. We could also easily see that the chalk can also not be, that this chalk ultimately need not be here and need not be at all. But then, as distinguished from that which can stand in being or fall back into non-being or not being, as distinguished from the being, what is being? I'll say that once again, it's a complicated syntax. But then, as distinguished from that which can stand in being or fall back into not being, as distinguished from the being, what is being? Is it the same as the being? We asked this once again, but we did not include being in our earlier catalog of attributes. We listed only material mass, grayish white light, formed in such and such a manner, breakable. Now, where is being to be found? It must, after all, belong to the chalk, for this chalk itself is. In light of the why not rather nothing question, the being of beings now seems elusive. We earlier said with confidence that it was what made a being a being. That's the being of beings, what makes a being a being. But we don't find this in a being, as this example of the chalk shows. And if we ask what it would be for what makes a being not to be, we seem to be stumped. So how should we describe the impasse that we've reached at this point? Heidegger suggests that the problem is that we do not know the sense of being, and hence, quote, how it stands with being and how being stands in its distinction from beings. He writes on page 36, second half of the page, if we pose this question about being as the first question in rank, then should we do so without knowing how it stands with being and how being stands in its distinction from beings? How are we even supposed to inquire into the ground for the being of beings, let alone be able to find it out, if we have not adequately conceived, understood, and grasped being itself. So, we say that the being of beings is what makes a being into a being, but have we grasped what this being with the capital B is? And if we haven't, how do we know what we're talking about? How are we even supposed to inquire into the ground for the being of beings, let alone be able to find it out if we have not adequately conceived, understood, and grasped being itself? This enterprise would be just as hopeless as if someone wanted to explain the cause and ground of a fire and declared that he need not bother with the course of the fire or the investigation of its scene. So it turns out that the question, why are there beings at all instead of nothing, forces us to the prior question, how does it stand with being? And the analogy with the investigation of a fire suggests that this, how does it stand with being? In German, this idiom you see on the bottom of the page there, the literal, the German original is reproduced there by the editors, translators. Wie steht es das Sein? This wie steht es is a idiomatic phrase that can be appropriately translated in various ways depending upon the situation. And in this context, probably the best way to think about this is in terms of ontological status, as you might have asked earlier about the status of numbers or universals. But Heidegger also suggests a kind of inflection to this in this comparison with the fire, where he says, if we want to explain the cause and ground of a fire, we have to investigate the scene. And we have to have an awareness of the course of the fire. So what is that going to have to do with the investigation of being? And that leads us to the question, what is the analog of the course of the fire or the scene of the fire when we're investigating being? And I think it's fair to say that for Heidegger, this is going to be the history of being, as this has unfolded in the course of the history of Western metaphysics. So how does it stand with being? That's the prior question we need to ask. How does this stand with being? What's the ontological status of being as this has unfolded or developed itself in the course of the history of being? That is a prior question to why are there beings at all rather than nothing. That's what he seems to be saying here. So what is the status of being? How does it stand? How does it stand with being? However we're going to grasp this, it seems like it's going to have to be indirectly through beings by which we grasp this. And Heidegger starts by giving us some examples of concrete being. So first he considers objects like a high school building, a grouse, a motor, and a piece of fabric. And some observations he makes about these beings is that the being of these beings is not any part or any contents of the being. So the being of a building is not any room or any part of a building, nor is it anything that the building contains. Also, the being of a being does not consist in our observation of that being. They retain their being even if we do not observe them. Moreover, the fact that we always sense more than what literally presents itself to the senses, what analytic philosophers would call the sense data. That, for example, we hear the grouse. We don't just hear the sounds of its call. I hear a grouse outside. I don't just hear the sound of a call. This suggests that being figures into the act of sensing in some way, but it doesn't seem that we literally sense it or directly sense it. In asking how it stands with beings, we also have to consider beings that surround us and determine the atmosphere in which we live, such as, in his examples, a heavy thunderstorm gathering in the mountains, a distant mountain range under a vast sky, the portal of a church, or the state. These things complicate the question of being because it seems that they disclose themselves differently to different people. So, for example, the portal of let's say a Renaissance era church is going to disclose itself differently to a historian of architecture and a member of a religious order that uses the church regularly. Then there's this final example on page 39, the middle of the page. A painting by Van Gogh, sometimes known as Van Gogh, but a painting by Van Gogh, a pair of sturdy peasant shoes, nothing else. The picture really represents nothing. Yet you are alone at once with what is there, as if you yourself were heading homeward from the field in a late autumn evening, tired with your hoe as the last potato fires smolder out. What is in being here? The canvas, the brushstrokes, the patches of color? The painting really represents nothing. Heidegger here suggests that art may have a privileged role in disclosing the being of beings, for example, a pair of peasant shoes as depicted in the painting, and also perhaps even the nothing itself. And those of you who are interested in exploring this further will want to look at Heidegger's famous and important essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, on this, where he takes up this painting by Van Gogh again. This brings us to Nietzsche's word about being. Being is a vapor. If we can't find being in beings, might this not be because the notion of being itself is some kind of philosophical error? Heidegger associates a view like this with Nietzsche, when Nietzsche characterizes being as a vapor and an error. The bottom of 39. But being remains undiscoverable, almost like nothing, or in the end entirely so. Being seems like it has a kinship with nothing in that they both seem undiscoverable. The word being is then finally just an empty word. Again, Heidegger is using this rhetorical technique of speaking in the voice of an opinion that one might have, not necessarily putting forth his own opinion about this. The word being is then finally just an empty word. It means nothing actual, tangible, real. Its meaning is an unreal vapor. So in the end, Nietzsche is entirely right when he calls the, quote, highest concepts, unquote, such as being, quote, the final wisp of evaporating reality, quoting the Twilight of the Idols. Who would want, back in Heidegger's own voice now, who would want to chase after such a vapor, the term for which is just the name for a huge error? And then another quote from Nietzsche, in fact, nothing up to now has been more naively persuasive than the error of being. Heidegger asks, being a vapor and an error? Actually, for Heidegger, Nietzsche is a victim of what Heidegger calls, quote, a long-standing errancy and neglect, unquote. What's going on here is that Nietzsche is merely recognizing what for Heidegger is the neglect of being that had been in Nietzsche's time, and still is, a long-standing neglect in the West. Heidegger is a prophet of a long-standing cultural decline, as Nietzsche was, or thought of himself as. He says on page 41, end of the first paragraph, what if it were possible that human beings, that peoples in their greatest machinations and exploits, have a connection to beings, but have long since fallen out of being, have a connection to beings, small b plural, but have long since fallen out of being, capital B, without knowing it? And what if this were the inmost and most powerful ground of their decline? This leads Heidegger to a question. Is being a mere word and a vapor? Or is it what he calls the spiritual fate of the West? Heidegger sees the West, Western civilization, in other words, as in a long-standing state of spiritual decline, dating back to pre-Socratic times. What, one would like to know, is the nature of this decline? Well, in Heidegger's time and place, 1935 Germany, and long after, the world was dominated by two superpowers, namely America and Russia. However, these powers were themselves dominated by a cultural mindset that had come to dominate humanity since the Industrial Revolution, and for Heidegger had been germinating for millennia before that. And this is what we might describe as the technological mindset. The technological mindset was the mindset dominating America and Russia. Or in more Heideggerian language, what dominates these two great forces is the understanding of being as something to be technically mastered. The understanding of being as something to be technically mastered. So in spite of their vast social, political, and moral differences, and one hopes that Heidegger would be capable of recognizing those, despite those differences, Heidegger sees in the USA and the Soviet Union the same metaphysical condition. So metaphysically speaking, they're the same, he says. Quote, the same hopeless frenzy of unchained technology and of the rootless organization of the average man, unquote. That's from page 43. Heidegger worries that the modern obsession with things like economic numbers, the numbers, as our president would say, with the stock market, with GDP, with economic so-called development, profit, materialism, infrastructure, consumerism, building factories, etc. He worries that all of this will lead to, or actually that it expresses a spiritual deadening, that it expresses a spiritual decline, a spiritual decadence that will lead to an even greater spiritual decline and decadence. And this greater spiritual decline or decadence is represented for him by the inability to any longer even recognize the question of being as a question. The question of being, the question, how does it stand with being? What are you talking about, right? A blank look. I don't understand. That's the sort of the danger that Heidegger is concerned the dominance of these powers and their concern with technological domination will lead to. Unfortunately, from our perspective, our hindsight, Heidegger in this work immediately threatens to discredit his pretensions to being a spiritually sensitive and prophetic person with his identification of the Germans as the metaphysical people. The people uniquely called to save the spirit of the West, a special people with a special calling and vocation to rescue the West from spiritual destitution. And of course, Heidegger sees himself as the leader of this effort, as der Führer of the spirit, the leader of the spirit. Now, in Heidegger's defense, and to try to be somewhat less arrogant from the perspective of hindsight, Germans by 1935 had long tended to think of themselves in this way as the spiritually gifted people, long before the Nazis. And it's the Germany of Kant and Winckelmann, of Goethe and Schiller, of Bach and Beethoven, of Hölderlin and Heidegger, and others that Heidegger's leaning on here. It's not the Nazis per se that represents the metaphysical vocation of the German people. Heidegger's concern is what we know actually happened, that this will happen in the decades after 1935, namely that the spiritually great Germany of the past will be swallowed up and absorbed into the American and Soviet empires, as in fact happened in 1945. And subsequently will become just another mere economic powerhouse. And that actually happened. The generation born since World War II has not produced much of the first spiritual rank, product of the first rank, spiritually speaking, in Germany. In the 2020s, no German institution can be reliably expected to be found in the various lists of the top 50 universities in the world, for example. In the 1920s, that would have been unthinkable. No German university in the top 50 universities in the world. And similar things could be said about other dimensions of culture as well. So that's what Heidegger, I think, is primarily concerned with, is this vocation that the Germans had from the preceding 200 years or so to be the spiritual leaders of the West. Well, what's the task that Heidegger sets for himself and for Germany as the supposed spiritual saviors of the West? He explains this on page 43. Second paragraph. To ask, how does it stand with being? This means nothing less than to repeat and retrieve the inception of our historical spiritual Dasein in order to transform it into the other inception. To repeat and retrieve the inception of our historical spiritual Dasein in order to transform it into the other inception. In other words, we need to retrace our steps and return thoughtfully to the inception of Western metaphysics, which means the inception of Western civilization as such, or the West as such. And in this return to re-experience what was discovered by the pre-Socratics, so as to bring ourselves back into the awareness of being. This will not be a mere recovery, however. We can't go back to being pre-Socratics. You can't go home again, and Heidegger, contrary to his reputation, isn't a pure reactionary. Rather, the inception will have to be begun again, more originally. So we need to ask the prior question that is included within the question, why is there being rather than nothing? Namely, how does it stand with being? So how should one proceed with this questioning? One key datum, as it were, is provided by Nietzsche's remark about being dissolved into a vapor. Nietzsche meant this as a mere dismissal. However, in spite of himself, Heidegger thinks, Nietzsche revealed something crucial, that for us, being has become like a vapor. Nietzsche's observation was correct. For us, being has become like a vapor. This nihilistic attitude towards being is a datum about the state of spiritual decline that we have reached in the West. But far from being a cause of mere despair, it can be a jumping off point for the beginning of a questioning about being. So on page 44, he says, towards the top, we will have to ask why this fact, the fact that being remains a vaporous word for us, stands out precisely today. We will have to ask whether and why it has persisted for a long time. We should learn to know that this fact is not as innocuous as it seems at first sight. For ultimately, what matters is not that the word being remains just a noise for us and its meaning just a vapor, but that we have fallen out of what this word is saying, and for now cannot find our way back. For now, we cannot find our way back to understanding the meaning of being. It is on these grounds and on no others that the word being no longer applies to anything, that everything, if we merely want to take hold of it, dissolves like a shred of cloud in the sun. This nihilistic attitude towards being is a datum about the spiritual decline that we've reached in the West, and that's what we need to, so to speak, dwell upon. That the fact that we can barely recognize the question of being today, and we seem totally lost in seeking out a way back to understanding it. Even the fact that we can barely recognize the question of being as a question today can be fruitful for thought if we thoughtfully inquire into why it is that we can no longer recognize this question. What happened to make this the case? That we're stuck in the way that we're stuck now. Now, we're not going to be able to make progress on the question of being by adopting a traditional metaphysical approach that's associated with the term of ontology. Ontology. So we talked about the ontological difference, which refers to ontology. Ontology can mean different things, and in one respect, Heidegger doesn't have a problem with using the term ontology, but what he's referring to here as ontology is a branch of metaphysics developed in the 17th century, Heidegger's accounting, which approaches being as the most universal concept. So it says, what do you mean we can't understand the meaning of being? Sure, we understand what being is. It's the most universal concept. Now, this is a tempting way to understand the essence of being. So especially you think about, some kind of taxonomy of species and genera, where you have, collections of different species associated with different higher level classifications. So you get the various types of animal. You have, reptiles, mammals, and then you have the category of animal. Then you have, living things, animals and plants, and so on. You go up this taxonomic pyramid, and you end up with the highest concept, right? Being. That's what being means, right? That would be the approach to the question of being that Heidegger is here associating with ontology. Why does he reject this? Why does he reject traditional ontology as a misunderstanding of being? Well, he's proposing an alternative way of understanding it. On page 46, he says, we ask the question, how does it stand with being? What is the meaning of being? Not in order to compose an ontology in the traditional style, much less to reckon up critically the mistakes of earlier attempts at ontology. We are concerned with something completely different. So really, he just sort of sidesteps this project of ontology, saying, I'm doing something different. The project of ontology is a misunderstanding of what I'm concerned with here. The point is to restore this historical Dasein of human beings back to the power of being. To restore the historical Dasein of human beings back to the power of being. The point is to restore the historical Dasein of human beings, and this also always means our own most future Dasein in the history that is allotted to us, back to the power of being that is to be opened up originally. All this, to be sure, only within the limits of philosophy's capability. This proposes a method of philosophical questioning. Maybe method is not the right word, but it proposes a philosophical questioning, a mode of questioning that is essentially historical. For Heidegger, philosophical questioning is essentially historical. The question, how does it stand with being? And the prior question, why are there beings at all rather than nothing, is not a mere academic issue, but is bound up with the historical fate and the historical destiny of the West. The relation between the question of being and the history of the West is an internal connection. It's not a mere matter of the influence that a philosophical theory can have, say, in the way that Marx's historical materialism influenced the history of Russia or of China. Rather, the history of the West is constituted by this questioning of being, insofar as it embodies the West's relation to being. This implies as well that Heidegger is not conceiving of philosophy as a historical science that's concerned with the scientific or scholarly study of the past. Instead, philosophy is concerned with the history that we are making now, the history that we are making now, the living history of the present, which is forging the future, while at the same time relating itself dynamically to the past. This is Dasein's historicality. It's essentially historical nature or historicity. We exist as historical being. Our Dasein is in a historical vein, you might say. History as a science, what we might call historiography, is derivative and parasitic upon this more basic and fundamental historicality or historicity of our mode of existence. So the authentic way to ask the fundamental metaphysical question is in and through our historical existence and in relation to our historical existence. This is because being discloses itself as a happening that is historical in nature. That's an important point, so I'll repeat it. Being discloses itself in a happening or an event that is historical in nature. Heidegger elucidates this as follows on page 49, second paragraph. Our asking of the fundamental metaphysical question is historical because it opens up the happening of human Dasein in its essential relations. That is, its relations to beings as such and as a whole, opens it up to possibilities not yet asked about, futures to come, and in this way also binds it back to its inception that has been, and thus sharpens it and gives weight to its burden in its present. In this questioning, our Dasein is summoned to its full history in the full sense of the word, and is called to make a decision in it. And this is not a derivative, useful application of this questioning in terms of morality and worldviews. Instead, the fundamental position and attitude of the questioning is in itself historical, stands and holds itself in the happening, and questions on the ground of this happening, questions on the ground of this happening and for this happening. So where do we stand in history? That's the next topic that Heidegger turns to. And it turns out that for Heidegger, the historical moment at which we find ourselves is unlike any other. It's characterized by spiritual destitution and what he calls the darkening of the world, by which he means the spiritual world. Heidegger initially gives 4 signs or symptoms of this darkening, which reveal here the depth of influence of the prophetic poetry of Hölderlin and Nietzsche on his thinking. So, some aspects of this darkening of the world. One is the flight of the gods. That the sense, in other words, of a higher spiritual ideal has vanished. In addition to the flight of the gods have flown, they've run away. In addition to this, there's the destruction of the earth, the devastation and exploitation of the natural world for the sake of profit, regardless of the sustainability of these exploitative practices or the reparability of the damage that's been done to the earth and the ecosystems. So the flight of the gods, the destruction of the earth. The third element that he mentions in this darkening of the world is the reduction of human beings to a mass. Think of the ubiquity of advertising, mass marketing, demographics, identity politics, the influence of money in elections, right? You can't compete, you can't run for that office because you don't have enough money. Well, why should that matter? Well, it's because that it's assumed that mass manipulation is the key to attaining political office, and that's supposed as a kind of massification of human beings. So the flight of the gods, the destruction of the earth, the reduction of human beings to a mass or their massification, and then finally the preeminence of the mediocre. Maybe a good example of this recently is that 27 candidates ran for the Democratic nomination, for the nomination of the largest political party and the most politically, economically, and culturally powerful country in the world. And the best they could do was Joe Biden. Come on, man. The preeminence of the mediocre, right? So the darkening of the world includes the flight of the gods, the destruction of the earth, the reduction of human beings to a mass, and the preeminence of the mediocre. That's the spiritual condition in which we find ourselves. The darkening of the world involves, for Heidegger, a disempowering of the spirit, a disempowering of the spirit. And this involves various dimensions as well. He refers to the disillusion of the spirit, the diminution of the spirit, the suppression of the spirit, and the misinterpretation of the spirit. And here Heidegger focuses on one dimension of this disempowering, which is the misinterpretation of the spirit. This involves four aspects that progressively build upon one another. First aspect of the misinterpretation of the spirit is the reinterpretation of the spirit as intelligence. The reinterpretation of spirit as intelligence, as cleverness and calculation, as ingenuity and organization. Our spiritual elites are, Wall Street quants and big tech entrepreneurs, clever people who are good at organizing things. That's the first misinterpretation of the spirit. The misinterpretation of the spiritual person as the clever person. Second, spirit is reduced to a tool of production and organization. Spirit is reduced to a tool of production and organization. There's an understanding that the most spiritual people are the most valuable people, the people who can produce the latest killer app, right? That can help you to be more productive in your business, that idea. Third misinterpretation of the spirit is the setting up of a distinct specialized realm of culture, specialized culture specialists, with an associated industry that operates according to standards of validity, otherwise known as peer review, mindlessly churning out more papers, symposia, gallery showings, biennials, etc. The university is uni, that is spiritually unified in name only. Really, it's just a hodgepodge of disconnected, specialized little cottage industries, churning out product, incestually, mutually supporting others in their specialization, doing the same elsewhere. So that's the third misinterpretation of the spirit, this distinct specialized realm of culture. And finally, the making of cultural institutions into showpieces and spectacles. Cultural capital to show off. Putting your prestigious diploma on your wall, getting into some prestigious grad school so your parents can brag about you to their friends, putting some letters after your name in order to validate your culture, your culturedness, right? Your cultured nature, your civilized character to others, and so forth. All of that is the misinterpretation of the spirit. In contrast to this, Heidegger speaks of the genuine essence of the spirit. The genuine essence of the spirit is the empowering of the powers of being, the empowering of the powers of being. In contrast to the misinterpretation, Heidegger says about this genuine essence of the spirit, this is on 54, 55. He's quoting himself here from his rectoral address. Spirit is neither empty acuity, nor the non-committal play of wit, nor the understanding's boundless pursuit of analysis, nor even world reason, but rather spirit is originally attuned, knowing resolution to the essence of being. Spirit is the empowering of the powers of being as such and as a whole. Spirit is originally attuned, knowing resolution to the essence of being, which empowers the powers of being as such and as a whole by asking the question of being and thereby awakening the spirit. That's the genuine spirit, as opposed to this counterfeit misinterpretation of the spirit as cleverness that's useful in production and organization and in sustaining these institutions of a cultural industry that become showpieces and spectacles. And only through the genuine spirit, it goes without saying, can the darkening of the world be overcome. The misinterpretation of the spirit is in fact a kind of effect and manifestation of the darkening of the world. This leads to the third discussion question. Third discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger that our Western civilization is in a state of spiritual decline? Do you agree with his analysis of the ways in which our culture misinterprets what spirit is? If you disagree, how do you know that this is not just because you are a victim of such a misinterpretation yourself? Does Heidegger have the right notion of spirit? If he is right about how we are in a state of spiritual destitution, do you believe it's possible for us to recover? If so, how? So once again, third discussion question. Do you agree with Heidegger that our Western civilization is in a state of spiritual decline? Do you agree with his analysis of the ways in which our culture misinterprets what spirit is? If you disagree, how do you know that this is not just because you are a victim of such a misinterpretation yourself? Does Heidegger have the right notion of spirit? If he's right about how we are in a state of spiritual destitution, do you believe it's possible for us to recover? And if so, how? In spite of Heidegger's hope, it remains a fact, a datum, that being is in fact almost nothing more than a word now, and its meaning is an evanescent vapor. This is our existential condition, so to speak, at this point in history. Heidegger calls it a state of our Dasein. At this historical moment, like it or not, we have a fraught relationship with being, or better, in being. Heidegger thinks that this manifests itself, perhaps first and foremost, in our relation to language, or in his terms, our misrelation and unrelation to language. The meaninglessness of the question of being might be thought to be an expression of, or a manifestation of, our use and abuse of language. However, for Heidegger, the complete atrophy of the naming power of being is an effect of our destroyed relation to being. And it's the dissolution of this relation that ultimately accounts for our misrelation to language. The fact that language no longer works for us in a spiritually empowering sense. This, of course, is the situation that Heidegger wants to change, and we'll go deeper into this topic in the next chapter.